Hello, everyone. I'm Merve Tahiroğlu, the Turkey Program Coordinator at POMED. For the latest episode of our author interview series, Between the Lines, I'm here with Dimitar Bechev to discuss his new book, Turkey Under Erdoğan, which was just published last week by Yale University Press. Thank you for joining me, Dimitar.
Thank you so much for having me.
A quick word on who Dimitar actually is. He's a political scientist and a lecturer at the University of Oxford in the UK. This is his third book, I believe, but his first book on Turkey. And it's quite an insightful book and really a good read. So I guess I want to say congratulations and thank you for your contributions to our understanding of Turkey.
Well, it's my pleasure, although I suspect there's nothing new you could learn from this book, but thank you for the kind words.
No, there definitely was, and I'm going to ask you about them now. So I guess I'll just dive in. I think that what captured my attention first is that your book sets out to answer one very big and important question. It's captured by the subtitle, How a Country Turned from Democracy and the West. Of course, Erdogan for the last 20 years has been ruling Turkey, one man. And during this time, the 20 years that passed by, the country has transformed greatly, as you say, by becoming both, on one hand, more authoritarian internally, and also in terms of its foreign policy and geopolitical orientation, turning away from the West. So I wanted to start off by asking you what is the connection between these two transformations and why you chose to study them together rather than as, I guess, separate developments.
Well, that's a very good question. Full disclosure, I'm originally a foreign policy scholar, and my element is the foreign relations of Turkey and its neighborhoods. But as I was working on the issue, and some of that research actually goes back to my days uh, as a foreign uh, as a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations when I was covering Turkey at 360 degrees. And remember, that was the time of Gezi Park. That was the time of the constitutional referendum in 2010, and the link between inside and out and external was very obvious and pressing. So a full account, which is the sort of thing that any publisher of a trade book is interested in, um, necessitates uh, shedding light on this interplay between the domestic arena and the outside. And there's so many connections, obviously. So yeah, I mean, I would have loved to write a more strictly academic book looking at what shapes Turkish foreign policy and what are the responses to it and what is the decision-making system. In fact, one of the works that I found inspiration from is a foreign policy book from 2003 that Philip Robbins wrote, Suits and Uniforms. But I think that will be another project. Um, Writing a book which covers so much ground is a challenge because you're synthesizing 20 plus years of experience and history. So much has gone on in the life of the country. No need to tell you, and it's a daunting task. I'm sure that there are a lot of omissions. There might be some issues of interpretation, but yeah, I mean, I hope I did my best in this project.
No, I think it was great because, you know, sometimes we tend to see turning away from democracy as the same thing as also turning away from the West, but those two things are not necessarily the same thing. Turkey could have, let's say, turned more authoritarian, but not necessarily in its foreign policy orientation, or vice versa. It could have democratized, but also, continued to pursue a more independent foreign policy. But I think your book really shows by telling the story of both changes together how they informed one another as well. And as you say, it's quite challenging to look at 20 years or so of history, and and this, I'm taking it to my second question, you actually take it way far beyond that. You start your story of what's been happening in Erdogan's Turkey from the 1980s, and 90s. This is interesting to me because many people attribute the changes in Turkey's domestic and foreign affairs to Erdoğan and Erdoğan's personal and, for some people, Islamist ideology. But when you trace it back, this period, to the presidency of particularly Turgut Özal, that really caught my eye. So I want to ask you, how did this period, the 1980s and 90s, and Özal's leadership, or as you call it, Özalism, I like this term, lay the groundwork for what we're seeing in Turkey today, or when Erdoğan came to power in the 21st
Well, you're
century?
absolutely right. It is a book about Erdogan, but it's also not a book about Erdogan. There's this strange dialectic because it looks at the country and its society and long-term evolution of politics and society. And there's so many connections because ultimately the AKP didn't come out of the blue. The ideological message, but also the circumstances that brought Erdogan to power, were product of this lost decade of the 1980s. And ironically enough, a point I'm making in the first chapter, we have gone full circle. Think about the Kurdish issue, Turkish foreign policy, if you will, the nationalist surge in Turkey, hyperinflation, economic boom and bust. For anybody who was around back then, and I was an undergraduate student, full disclosure, in those days, those sound very familiar, which is very ironic because ultimately Erdogan, a bit like Putin in Russia, came with this message that now the 90s was the dark period, that was the lost decade, and now Turkey is bouncing back, and it's all about rejuvenating the country. But ironically or not, we have gone full circle in many respects. But yeah, I mean, going back to your question, I sort of diverged a bit. A lot what you've seen, especially in the first decade of AKP rule, can be traced to the reforms in the 1980s when Turkey liberalized its economy, opened not just to what people have called the strategic West, in other words NATO, but also to globalization and sort of new liberal capitalism. But also the kind of the brand of politics, having a center-right party with a big tent understanding of politics, capturing the center ground, but leaving those open to all kinds of factions on the liberal left even, and also being more open-minded about minority issues, is precisely what we had later on when the AKP appeared on the scene, this sort of winning mixture. Same thing with foreign policy. A lot of people credited Ahmet Davutoğlu with inventing zero problems with neighbors, or generally the idea that Turkey should be much more active and embrace its neighbors and work on the economic front and project soft power. But that was there before. Turkish foreign policy didn't start in 2002. Özal was playing with the same set of ideas in the Middle East and eventually in Central Asia and the Balkans after the end of the Cold War. So there's so many continuities you can observe there. And if you start writing the story of Turkey, you realize that 2002 is not a very good starting point to have a much more seamless discussion. You have to go a bit further back in time and see how those issues played out over the years.
Yeah, you trace a lot of similarities, I mean, both in terms of foreign policy at the time, and, as you said, the Big Tent politics, but also the polarization and the seeds of polarization between religious conservatives and seculars, and the Kurds and Turks with the Kurdish issue. All of it, from your telling, to me, is eerily similar to a lot of what we're seeing under Erdogan as well, and it makes you question how unique all of this is to Erdogan himself. But let me follow up on some of them. Particularly, I want to first look at the domestic aspect just a little bit. You do. You say that Özal's presidency helped plant the seeds of this polarization that Erdogan very much is a product of, and then also exacerbated. I want to talk about how, in your opinion, Erdogan exacerbated these problems and the us versus them divide, which as you say in your book, I'm going to quote it, that Erdogan not only implemented the populist playbook, but now we're taking to the 2010s and onwards, but that he, in many respects, authored the populist playbook, and he has done it in many ways by pitting the people or the masses against the elites. How do you see the way he approached all this polarization that is a product of the 80s and 90s in Turkey?
Well, it's always a two-way street. There's some societal trends, so there's the bottom-up dynamic, but leadership always plays a key role in gatekeeping or channeling or selectively picking on some trends. And if you look at Turkish political history, it's clear that Erdogan made good use of this polarization, because he ultimately sensed that his political survival or political prospects are contingent on being able to play with it. And many critical junctures, clearly in 2007, when the whole issue of the presidency was at stake, later on in 2008 with the closure of the party, then with the constitutional referendum, and of course with Gezi Park. So any of those junctures, Erdogan played the polarization card. And I must say that he's not the only culprit. In 2007, it was also the opposition in the face of the People's Republican Party, which sort of went for this game and they lost. So there was a collusion on both sides. But yeah, Erdogan is the quintessential populist trying to exploit the rifts. In any divided society, you have other potential strategies you can pursue. You can try to coalesce, build consensus, share power. And to his credit, Erdogan has done that as well. The book is also an account of how he juggled the various coalitions, and there's nothing original. Other people have covered it in the trade. But yeah, I mean, his first pro-EU coalition involved various factions, and then he reshuffled it, and now he's aligned with the nationalists. So he's both a master of dividing people, but also in assembling various governance blocks.
Yeah, maybe as you say, the first 10 years of his premiership in Turkey, as you call this big tent politics, some of our listeners might be questioning, well, how can he be, exploiting polarization, but also managing to achieve big tent politics, getting votes and support much beyond his small Islamist base, as I'm going to call it. You say that Erdogan didn't become this way overnight. Actually, you say it didn't become a Putin lookalike overnight, but it was more of an evolution or a devolution on his part. There have been many junctures, but you start those changes in July, as I understand it, in July 2008, really, of how Erdogan changed from pursuing this more big tent politics and more reforms and everything. And after July 2008, perhaps we can see it as with the closure case, we can see a big change. How important was this closure case? Can you tell us a little bit about that, particularly for people who don't know about this closure case and how it impacted Erdogan?
Well, I think it was pretty big. Although we have an internal debate with some of my friends and who cover Turkish politics, and I mean, just to backtrack a little bit, the question is, did Erdogan have a master plan from the very day he got into politics? or did he adapt and he decided that clinging to power no matter what was the only viable strategy? I tend to subscribe to the latter school. Some of my best friends are much more skeptical of this argument and say, no, he was an authoritarian leader to start with, and he didn't have, I mean, democracy was very instrumental in his mindset. But yeah, I mean, the closure case, all things being equal, was when it was very clear that life in opposition would be very difficult for him, that the establishment was out there to get him, that the only way to actually survive really was just to be in power, which, just to fast track to the present, raises lots of questions about the future. The problem with authoritarian systems or semi-authoritarian systems is there is no exit option. Very often you either stay in power or you go to exile or you go to jail. There is nothing in between. So the costs of surrendering power are prohibitive. You might think whatever you about democracies, that they're dysfunctional, that they sort of don't deliver on public policy. Yeah, you have X number of grievances, but one thing that democracies give incumbents is the option just to retire and have a decent life. So you can be, say, a former politician of, say, Süleyman Demirel, who lived to the end of his life in Ankara and had a comfortable life. He was a senior statesman. That's not on the menu for Erdoğan. And I think the turning point was somewhere in the late 2000s. Now, going back to the beginning of my answer, and this is not really your question, but it's worth exploring this theme. AKP in the early years was not just Erdoğan. It was a consortium. It was a proper party, but also there was this triumvirate at the top with Abdullah Gül, right? And that was the case. That changed after Gezi Park, when Erdoğan, and potentially even earlier, when Erdoğan managed to get turn it into his own political fiefdom and sort of sideline everyone else. And lo and behold, now we have all those leftovers from the AKP siding with the opposition with a six-party arrangement. So that's what's happened. So even if Erdoğan had this plan to emerge as a strongman, he had to compromise and to live with others in the party, but also to function in a political system which was polarized, but at the same time more pluralistic, and you had to to negotiate your way through it, and that became less and less the case in the second decade of AKP rule, obviously.
Well, when we look at this change, and if we take it as, did he have a master plan? Was he always just exploiting these conditions just to amass power, or was he genuinely more democratic and changed over time? It's a big question, but also a huge impact on all of this, a huge factor impacting all of this was the EU. And you have a whole chapter about this. It's, Erdoğan started off by very much wanting to join the EU, and then in that process, in that process, he implemented a lot of the democratizing reforms that were required to be part of that process. And you say that the EU has had this narrative that the process of joining the EU, EU has always said the process of joining the organization had transformed former authoritarian countries into thriving democracies. And that is a narrative that they played in Turkey as well. But clearly, this is not what happened. Now, let's say 15 years into that process, 20 years into that process, Turkey is far from joining the EU, I would say farther than it's ever been, and also farther than democracy than it's ever been. So what happened here?
That's a big part of the story, because EU sustained many of those dynamics. It's not that the EU single-handedly pushed Turkey on the democratization path, but it made possible, for instance, this coalition we mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, that lots of liberal, left-leaning, reformist people were voting AKP, all the way to Gezi, some of them. Others gave up a bit earlier on Erdoğan. But yeah, I mean, zooming out a bit, there's a bit of a fallacy about the EU in general, not just in relation to Turkey, that EU is this cause of democratic development. Whereas the way I see it, and I think the Turkish case study shows it as well, is that it's a contributing factor. You have to have a domestic dynamic that which you then lock in. That was the case in Spain and Greece in the 1970s and early 80s. I think that was the case in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1990s. And ultimately, that's the case in Turkey. The moment the domestic dynamic changed in Turkey, the EU became irrelevant. But that's only 50% of the story. The more unpleasant truth is that the EU made it worse, because around 2007, and I think the French election when Sarkozy gained the presidency, was a turning point. It was very clear that the promise of membership was not there, that the EU sort of reneged on Turkey. But of course, there's the counterfactual. What would Turkey look like if the EU was sincere? Or even if Turkey was a member state? I think it would have been marginally better, right? Because there will be a bit more of a constraint on Erdogan, but not much, because we've seen also countries in the EU, and Hungary is probably the most obvious case. It's a system that in some ways resembles Turkey, authoritarian, but also competitive, where you have leaders or leader in the case of Orban capturing the EU and using it to his interest. So a Turkey within the EU with this sort of domestic political dynamic, and a leader like Erdogan would not be a success story, unfortunately. But still, I mean, it would be probably would have been much better to have this scenario than what we had starting 2007, 2008.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up Hungary. A lot of Turkish political analysts are watching Hungary very closely right now in the election there. And, you know, as a democracy activist, I haven't given up on either country yet. So I do tend to see the positive.
That's a very important point, actually. And that's something I think the book is about. And I mean, some colleagues take an issue with a sentence in the conclusion that it will be Erdogan's Turkey in the future.
Oh,
Whereas
I will ask you about that for sure.
although, I mean, but to put my cards on the table, I think one of the analytical points I want to really hammer through is that Turkey has a lot of democratic resilience. There's a silver lining in this story. Historically, it's been very hard for Turkey to consolidate a proper liberal democratic regime for X number of reasons. But the opposite is true as well, consolidating an autocratic regime, like the one we've seen in the post-Soviet space or in the Middle East or elsewhere in the Turkish neighborhood, is very difficult. So it's a very pluralistic system. The average Turkish citizen has experience with competitive elections, and they know their vote matters. And that counts for something. So yeah, I mean, it's going back to what you said about Hungary and Turkey. It's not over. There'll always be contestation, even if the playing field won't be even. And the incumbents, be it Erdogan or Orban, will have the upper hands. But we've seen lots of pushback from civil society and from the party scene as well, which is very remarkable for anybody who studies those regimes.
Well, okay, let me follow up and maybe end on this note then with your in your epilogue as I was also quite jarred to read that, you look at in your epilogue, what will Turkey look like 20 years from now? And you very much say it will be Erdoğan's Turkey, and Erdoğanism will continue to inform both domestic politics and dynamics in Turkey, but also its foreign policy. You do also say at the very end, though, and something you trace in the book, as we said, a lot of Erdogan's foreign policy, particularly regional ambitions in terms of having better relations or more influence in the Balkans and the Caucasus and Central Asia and the Middle East, is actually a continuation of the 1990 of a process that started in the 1990s. And you say that it's likely that Turkey will always have these ambitions and will continue to want these ambitions, but for it to be able to realize the full potential of its soft power and these foreign policy ambitions, it will need to deliver economic growth first, and it will need to democratize. So even with your, I'm going to call it pessimistic, sorry, thinking about Turkey's future, do you think that Turkey can democratize and get out of this conundrum that it seems to be stuck in with, hyperpolarization and authoritarianism at home? Um, do you think it's possible for it to even if Erdoganism continues to inform all these dynamics, it could democratize and
I think so. Yeah, my money is on that. I mean, there's some good people in the discipline working on comparisons between Latin America and Turkey, and I think it's a very promising avenue. In Latin America, you have cases of countries moving backwards and forwards between democratic regime and forms of authoritarianism. And the pendulum in Turkey will eventually, I think, once Erdogan is gone, swing back to the old Turkey, which is messy, it's contentious, it's sort of polarized, and it's not the democracy that you think of when you look at, say, Scandinavia or the UK, even if you have some issues with established democracies. It will be a flawed democracy, electoral regime, but it won't be the system we have now. I think this is where the smart money is. The default of Turkish political life is to have this kind of semi-regime, semi-democratic regime, but it will be much more democratic than now. So we're not expecting a success story, but clearly I think autocracy has run its course. When you think about the debate you have about the presidential system, it was sold to the electorate as the best arrangement that would deliver the right set of public policies and set Turkey on sustainable developmental course. And people bought it, at least a sufficient part of the electorate, 50 plus. I mean, just enough during the 2017 referendum. It doesn't cut it anymore. Posters have shown that people have been disenchanted with this promise. And by people, you don't just mean your average political junkie living in a big Western Turkish metropolis, but the average person in the street now is politically savvy enough to understand the limits of this system. One of the big debates now is how to lower the electoral threshold, which again is an undemocratic feature of the political system, even before Erdogan arrived. So I think the pendulum is swinging in the other direction. Going forward, who will Erdogan pass the baton to? Who will be his successor at the throne? There is nobody around. I mean, there was, of course, the son-in-law, but then again, the economic meltdown ruled him out. There was Süleyman Soylu, but after the revelations, the mafia boss revelations, that's off the cards. But it's a generic problem. It's very difficult to ensure in one-man regimes the issue of succession. So that's why if you put all that together, plus the fact that Turkey is still dependent on the outside world, especially economically, it's part of the European marketplace and the West in some sense. If you put all that together, society, the economy, the institutional issues, the party dynamics, the leadership dynamics, I have no doubt that eventually there'll be a transition back into a democratic regime, which will be, again, imperfect. And it's not the end of the Turkish story, but again, it's superior to what we have right now.
I will take that as an optimistic note
Yeah.
and end our discussion here. Again, the book is Turkey Under Erdoğan, published by Yale University Press. I recommend everybody read it. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.